So today we're going to be listening to, from the box set, Mood Music for Listening and Relaxation. We're going to be listening to disc number 5, which is Melodies for Piano and Orchestra. So let's get that going, and then I'm going to jump into the book. Cheers. When word came over the communicators that the last pocket of resistance on the rebel ship had been cleaned out, the captain of the Imperial cruiser relaxed considerably. He was listening with pleasure to the proceedings on the captured vessel when one of his chief gunnery officers called to him. Moving to the man's position, the captain stared into the circular view screen and saw a tiny dot dropping away toward the fiery world below. "There goes another pod, sir. Instructions?" The officer's hand hovered over a computerized energy battery. Casually, confident in the firepower and total control under his command, the captain studied the nearby readout monitor, and he saw that all of them were blank. "Hold your fire, Lieutenant Iha. Instruments show no life forms aboard. The pod's release mechanism must have short-circuited or received a false instruction. Don't waste your power." He turned away to listen with satisfaction to the reports of captured men and material coming from the rebel ship. Glare from exploding panels and erupting circuitry reflected crazily off the armor of the lead stormtrooper as he surveyed the passageway ahead. He was about to turn and call for those behind to follow him forward when he noticed something moving off to one side. It appeared to be crouching back in a small dark alcove. Holding his pistol ready, he moved cautiously forward and peered into the recess. A small, shivering figure, clad in flowing white, hugged the back of the recess and stared up at the man. Now he could see that he faced a young woman, and her physical description fit that of the one individual the Dark Lord was most interested in. The trooper grinned behind his helmet. A lucky encounter for him. He would be commended. Within the armor, his head turned slightly, directing his voice to the tiny condenser microphone. "Here she is," he called to those behind him. "Set for stun for..." He never finished the sentence, just as he would never receive the hoped-for commendation. Once his attention turned from the girl to his communicator, her shivering vanished with startling speed. The energy pistol that she held out of sight behind her came up and around as she burst from her hiding place. The trooper, who had been unlucky enough to find her, fell first. His head, a mass of melted bone and metal. The same fate met the second armored form coming up fast behind him. Then a bright green energy pole touched the woman's side, and she slumped instantly to the deck, the pistol still locked in her small palm. Metal-encased shapes clustered around her. One, whose arm bore the insignia of a lower officer, knelt and turned her over. He studied the paralyzed form with a practiced eye. "She'll be all right," he finally declared, looking up at his subordinates. "Report to Lord Vader." Threepio stared mesmerized out of the small viewport set in the front of the tiny escape pod as the hot yellow eye of Tatooine began to swallow them up. Somewhere behind them, he knew the crippled fighter and the Imperial cruiser were receding to imperceptibility. That was fine with him. If they landed near a civilized city, he would seek elegant employment and a holocron atmosphere, something more befitting his status and training. These past months had gifted him with entirely too much excitement and unpredictability for a mere machine. Artoo's seemingly random manipulation of the pod's controls promised anything but a smooth landing. However, Threepio regarded his squat companion with concern. Are you sure you know what you're doing? Do you know how to pilot this thing?" Artoo replied with a non-committal whistle that did nothing to alter the taller robot's jangled state of mind. And with that, we conclude Chapter 1. Chapter 2. It was an old settler's saying that you could burn your eyes out faster by staring straight and hard at the sun-scorched flatlands of Tatooine than by looking directly at its two huge suns themselves. So powerful was the penetrating glare reflected from those endless wastes. Despite the glare, life could and did exist in the flatlands formed by long evaporated seabeds. One thing made it possible: the reintroduction of water. For human purposes, however, the water of Tatooine was only marginally accessible. The atmosphere yielded its moisture with reluctance. It had to be coaxed down out of the hard blue sky, coaxed, forced, yanked down to the parchful surface. Two figures whose concern was obtaining that moisture were standing on a slight rise of one of those inhospitable flats. One of the pair was a stiff and metallic, a sand-pitted evaporator sunk securely through sand and into deeper rock. The figure next to it was a good deal more animated, though no less sun-weathered. Luke Skywalker was twice the age of the 10-year-old evaporator, much less secure. At the moment, he was swearing softly at a recalcitrant valve adjuster on the temperamental device. From time to time, he resorted to some unsubtle pounding in place of using the appropriate tool. Neither method worked. Luke was sure that the lubricants used on the evaporators went out of their way to attract sand, beckoning seductively to small abrasive particles with an oily gleam. He wiped sweat from his forehead and leaned back for a moment. The most prepossessing thing about the young man was his name. A light breeze tugged at his shaggy hair and baggy work tunic as he regarded the device. No point in staying angry at it, he counseled himself. It's only an unintelligent machine. As Luke considered his predicament, a third figure appeared, scooting out from behind the evaporator to fumble awkwardly at the damaged section. Only 3 of the Treadwell model robot's 6 arms were functioning, and these had seen more wear than the boots on Luke's feet. The machine moved with unsteady stop-and-start motions. Luke gazed at it sadly, then inclined his head to study the sky. Still no sign of a cloud, and he knew there never would be unless he got that evaporator working. He was about to try once again when a small intense gleam of light caught his eye. Quickly, he slipped the carefully cleaned set of macro binoculars from his utility belt and focused the lenses skyward. For long moments, he stared, wishing all the while that he had a real telescope instead of the binocs. He stared. Evaporators, the heat, the day's remaining chores were forgotten. Clipping the binoculars back onto his belt, Luke turned and dashed for the land speeder. Halfway to the vehicle, he thought to call behind him. "Hurry up!" he shouted impatiently. "What are you waiting for? Get in gear!" The Treadwell started toward him, hesitated, then commenced spinning in a tight circle, smoke belching from every joint. Luke shouted further instructions, then finally gave up in disgust when he realized that it would take more than words to motivate the Treadwell again. For a moment, Luke hesitated at leaving the machine behind, but he argued to himself its vital components were obviously shot. So he jumped into the land speeder, causing the recently repaired repulsion floater to list alarmingly to one side until he was about to equalize the weight distribution by sliding behind the controls. Maintaining its altitude slightly above the sandy ground, the light-duty transport vehicle steadied itself like a boat in a heavy sea. Luke gunned the engine, which whined in protest, and sand erupted from behind the floater as he aimed the craft toward the distant town of Anchorhead. Behind him, a pitiful beacon of black smoke from the burning robot continued to rise into the clear desert air. It wouldn't be there when Luke returned. There were scavengers of metal as well as flesh in the wide wastes of Tatooine. Metal and stone structures bleached white by the glaze of twin Tatooine 1 and 2 huddled together tightly, for company as much as for protection. They formed the nexus of the widespread farming community of Anchorhead. Presently, the dusty, unpaved streets were quiet, deserted. Sandflies buzzed lazily in the cracked eaves of pourstone buildings. A dog barked in the distance, the sole sign of habitation, until a lone old woman appeared and started across the street. Her metallic sun shawl was pulled tight around her. Something made her look up, tired eyes squinting into the distance. The sound suddenly leaped in volume as a shining rectangular shape came roaring around a far corner. Her eyes popped as the vehicle bore down on her, showing no sign of altering its path. She had to scramble to get out of its way. Panting and waving angry fists after the land speeder, she raised her voice over the sound of its passage. "Won't you kids ever learn to slow down?" Luke might have seen her, but he certainly didn't hear her. In both cases, his attention was focused elsewhere. As he pulled up behind a low, long concrete station, various coils and rods jutted from its tops and sides. Tatooine's relentless sand waves broke in frozen yellow spume against the station's walls. No one had bothered to clean them away. There was no point. They would only return again the following day. Luke slammed the front door aside and shouted, "Hey!" A rugged young man in mechanic's dress sat sprawled in a chair behind the station's unkept control desk. Sunscreen oil had kept his skin from burning. The skin of the girl on his lap had been equally protected, and there was a great deal more of the protected area in view. Somehow, even dried sweat looked good on her. "Hey, everybody," Luke yelled again, having elicited something less than an overwhelming response with his first cry. He ran toward the instrument room at the rear of the station, while the mechanic, half asleep, ran a hand across his face and mumbled, "Did I hear a young noise blast through here?" The girl on his lap stretched sinuously, her well-worn clothing tugging in various intriguing directions. Her voice was casually throaty. "Oh," she yawned, "that was just Wormie on one of his rampages." Deke and Windy looked up from the computer-assisted pool game as Luke burst into the next room. They were dressed much like Luke, although their clothing was of better fit and somewhat less exercised. All three youths contrasted strikingly with the burly, handsome player at the far side of the table. From neatly clipped hair to his precision-cut uniform, he stood out in the room like an oriental puppy in a sea of oats. In a sea of oats. Behind the three humans, a soft hum came from where a repair robot was working patiently on a broken piece of station equipment. "Shape it up, you guys," Luke yelled excitedly. Then he noticed the older man in the uniform. The subject of his suddenly startled gaze recognized him instantly. "Biggs!" The man's face twisted in a half grin. "Hello, Luke." Then they were embracing each other warmly. Luke finally stood away, openly admiring the other's uniform. "I didn't know you were back. When did you get in?" The confidence in the other's voice bordered on the realm of smugness without quite entering it. "Just a little while ago. I wanted to surprise you, hotshot." He indicated the room. "I thought you'd be here with these other two nightcrawlers." Deke and Windy both smiled. "I certainly didn't expect you to be out working." He laughed easily, a laugh few people found resistible. "The Academy didn't change you much," Luke commented. "But you're back so soon." His expression grew concerned. "Hey, what happened? Didn't you get your commission?" There was something evasive about Biggs as he replied, looking slightly away. "Of course I got it. Signed to serve aboard the freighter Rand Ecliptic just last week. First Mate Biggs Darklighter at your service." He performed a twisting salute, half serious and half humorous, then grinned, that overbearing yet ingratiating grin again. "I just came back to say goodbye to all you unfortunate landlocked simpletons." They all laughed until Luke suddenly remembered what had brought him here in such a hurry. "I almost forgot," he told them, his initial excitement returning. "There's a battle going on right here in our system. Come and look." Deke looked disappointed. "Not another one of your epic battles, Luke. Haven't you dreamed up enough of them? Forget it." "Forget it? Hell, I'm serious. It's a battle, all right." With words and shoves, he managed to cajole the occupants of the station out into the strong sunlight. Cammy, in particular, looked disgusted. "This had better be worth it, Luke," she warned him, shading her eyes against the glare. Luke already had his macro binoculars out and was searching the heavens. It took only a moment for him to fix on a particular spot. "I told you," he insisted. "There they are." Biggs moved alongside him and reached for the binoculars as the other strained unaided eyes. A slight readjustment provided just enough magnification for Biggs to make out two silvery specks against the dark blue. "That's no battle, hotshot," he decided, lowering the binocs and regarding his friend gently. "They're just sitting there. Two ships, all right. Probably a barge loading a freighter, since Tatooine hasn't got an orbital station." There was a lot of firing earlier," Luke added. His initial enthusiasm was beginning to falter under the withering assurance of his older friend. Cammy grabbed the binoculars away from Biggs, banging them slightly against a support pillar in the process. Luke took them away from her quickly, inspecting the casing for damage. "Hey, take it easy with those." "Don't worry so much, Wormie," she sneered. Luke took a step toward her, then halted as the huskier mechanic easily interposed himself between them and frowned at Luke with a warming smile. Luke considered and then shrugged the incident away. "I keep telling you, Luke," the mechanic said with the air of a man tired of repeating the same story to no avail. "The rebellion is a long way away from here. I doubt if the Empire would fight to keep this system. Believe me, Tatooine is a big hunk of nothing." His audience began to fade back into the station before Luke could mutter a reply. Fixer had his arm around Cammy, and the two of them were chuckling over Luke's ineptitude. Even Deke and Windy were murmuring among themselves about him. Luke was certain. He followed them, but not without a last glance back up at the two distant specks. One thing he was sure of were the flashes of light he had seen between the two ships. They hadn't been caused by the suns of Tatooine reflecting off the metal. The binding that locked the girl's hands behind her back was primitive and effective. The constant attention the squad of heavily armed troopers favored her with might have been out of place for one small female, except for the fact that their lives depended on her being delivered safely. When she deliberately slowed her pace, however, it became apparent that her captors did not mind mistreating her a little. One of the armored figures shoved her brutally in the small of the back, and she nearly fell. Turning, she gave the offending soldier a vicious look, but she could not tell if it had any effect, since the man's face was completely hidden by his armored helmet. The hallway they eventually emerged into was still smoking around the edges of the smoldering cavity, blasted through the hull of the fighter. A portable accessway had been sealed to it, and a circlet of light showed at the far end of the tunnel, bridging space between the rebel craft and the cruiser. A shadow moved over her as she turned from inspecting the accessway, startling her despite her usually unshakable self-control. Above her towered the threatening bulk of Darth Vader, red eyes glaring behind the hideous breath mask. A muscle twitched in one smooth cheek. But other than that, the girl didn't react, nor was the slightest shake in her voice. "Darth Vader, I should have known. Only you would be so bold, and so stupid. Well, the Imperial Senate will not sit still for this. When they hear that you've attacked a diplomatic mission, Senator Leia Organa," Vader rumbled softly through the strongly enough to override her protests. His pleasure at finding her was evident in the way he savored every syllable. "Don't play games with me, Your Highness," he continued ominously. "You aren't on any mercy mission this time. You passed directly through a restricted system, ignoring numerous warnings and completely disregarding orders to turn about until it was no longer mattered." The huge metal skull dipped close.
"I know that several transmissions were beamed to this vessel by spies within the system. When we traced those transmissions back to the individuals with whom they originated, they had the poor grace to kill themselves before they could be questioned. I want to know what happened to the data they sent you."
Neither Vader's words nor his inimicable presence appeared to have any effect on the girl. "I don't know what you're blathering about," she snapped, looking away from him. "I'm a member of the Senate on a diplomatic mission to..."
"You're a part of the Rebel Alliance,"
Vader declared, cutting her off accusingly.
"You're also a traitor."
His gaze went to a nearby officer.
"Take her away."
She succeeded in reaching him with her spit, which hissed against still hot battle armor. He wiped the offensive matter away silently, watching her with interest as she was marched through the accessway into the cruiser. A tall, slim soldier wearing the sign of the Imperial Commander attracted Vader's attention as he came up next to him. "Holding her is dangerous," he ventured, likewise looking after her as she was escorted toward the cruiser. "If word of this does get out, there will be much unrest in the Senate. It will generate sympathy for the rebels." The commander looked up at the unreadable metal face, then added in an offhanded manner, She should be destroyed immediately.
No, my first duty is to locate that hidden fortress of theirs,
Vader replied easily.
All the rebel spies have been eliminated by our hand and by their own. Therefore, she is now my only key to discovering the location. I intend to make full use of her. If necessary, I will use her up, but I will learn the location of the rebel base.
The commander pursed his lips, shook his head slightly, perhaps a bit sympathetically, as he considered the woman. She'll die before she gives you any information. Vader's reply was chilling in its indifference.
Leave that to me.
He considered a moment, then went on.
Send out a wideband distress signal. Indicate that the Senator's ship encountered an unexpected meteorite cluster it could not avoid. Readings indicate that the shift in shields were overridden, and the ship was hulled to the point of vacating 95% of its atmosphere. Inform her father and the Senate that all aboard were killed.
A cluster of tired-looking troops marched purposefully up to their commander and Dark Lord. Vader eyed them expectantly.
The data tapes in question are not
Aboard this ship, there's no valuable information in the ship's storage banks and no evidence of bank erasure. The officer in charge recited mechanically. Nor were any transmissions directed outward from the ship from the time we made contact. A malfunctioning lifeboat pod was ejected during the fighting, but it was confirmed that no one was aboard. Vader appeared thoughtful.
It could have been a malfunctioning pod,
he mused.
That might have also contained the tapes. Tapes are not life forms. In all probability, any native finding them would just ignore them, and their importance would likely not be clear to them for their own use. But still.
Send out a detachment and retrieve them, or to make certain they are in the pod, he finally ordered the commander and the attentive officer.
Be as subtle as possible. There is no need to attract attention, even on this miserable outpost world.
As the officer and troops departed, Vader turned his gaze back to the commander.
Vaporize this fighter. We don't want to leave anything. As for the pod, I cannot take the chance it was a simple malfunction. The data it might contain could prove too damaging. See to this personally, Commander, and if those data tapes exist, they must be retrieved or destroyed at all costs.
Then he added with satisfaction,
With that accomplished, and the Senator in our hands, we will see the end of this absurd rebellion.
It shall be as you direct, Lord Vader, the commander acknowledged. Both men entered the accessway to the cruiser.
What a forsaken place this is.
Threepio turned cautiously to look back at where the pod lay, half buried in sand. His internal gyros were still unsteady from the rough landing. Mere application of the term unduly flattered his dull associate. On the other hand, he supposed he ought to be grateful they had come down to this place in one piece. Although he mused as he studied the barren landscape, he still wasn't sure they were better off here than they would have been had they remained on the captured cruiser. High sandstone mesas dominated the skyline to one side. Every other direction showed only endless series of marching dunes, like long yellow teeth stretching for kilometer on kilometer into the distance. Sand ocean blended into the skylight glare until it was impossible to distinguish where one ended and the other began. A faint cloud of minute dust particles rose in their wake as the two robots marched away from the pod. That vehicle, its intended function fully discharged, was now quite useless. Neither robot had been designed for pedal locomotion on this kind of terrain, so they had to fight their way across the unstable surface.
We seem to have been made to suffer,
Threepio moaned in self-pity.
It's our rotten existence.
Something squeaked in his right leg, and he winced.
I've got to rest before I fall apart. My internals still haven't recovered from that headlong crash you called a landing.
He paused, but R2-D2 did not. The little automaton had performed a sharp turn and was now ambling slowly but steadily in the direction of the nearest outjut of mesa.
Hey!
Threepio yelled. R2 ignored the call and continued striding.
Where do you think you're going?
Now R2 paused, emitting a stream of electronic explanation, as Threepio exhaustedly walked over to join him.
Well, I'm not going that way,
Threepio declared when R2 had concluded his explanation.
It's too rocky.
He gestured in the direction they had been walking at, an angle away from the cliffs.
This way is much easier.
A metal hand waved disparagingly at the high mesa.
What makes you think that there are any settlements that way anyhow?
I'll pause real quick and flip the record. And where were we? Yes.
What makes you think that there are any settlements that way anyhow?
A long whistle issued from the depths of R2.
Don't get technical with me,
Threepio warned.
I've had just about enough of you and your decisions.
R2 beeped once.
All right, go your way,
Threepio announced grandly.
You'll be sandlogged within a day, you nearsighted scrap pile.
He gave the R2 unit to a shove, sending the smaller robot tumbling down a slight dune. As it struggled at the bottom to regain its feet, Threepio started off toward the blurred, glaring horizon, glancing back over his shoulder.
And don't let me catch you following me, begging for help,
he warned,
because you won't get it.
Below the crest of the dune, the R2 unit righted itself. It paused briefly to clean its single electronic eye with an auxiliary arm. Then it produced an electronic squeal, which was almost, though not quite, a human expression of rage. Humming quietly to itself, then it turned and trudged off toward the sandstone ridges, as if nothing had happened. Several hours later, a straining Threepio, his internal thermostat overheated and edging dangerously toward overheat shutdown, struggled to the top of what he hoped was the last towering dune. Nearby pillars and buttresses of bleached calcium, the bones of some enormous beast, formed an unpromising landmark. Reaching the crest of the dune, Threepio peered anxiously ahead. Instead of the hoped-for greenery of human civilization, he saw only several more dunes, identical in form and promise to the one he now stood upon. The farthest rose even higher than the one he presently surmounted. Threepio turned and looked back toward the now far-off rocky plateau, which was beginning to grow indistinct with distance and heat distortion.
You malfunctioning little twerp,
he muttered, unable even now to admit to himself that perhaps, just possibly, the R2 unit might have been right.
This is all your fault. You tricked me into going this way, but you'll do no better.
Nor would he if he didn't continue on. So he took a step forward and heard something grind dully within a leg joint. Sitting down in the electronic funk, he began picking sand from his encrusted joints. He could continue on his present course, he told himself, or he could confess to an error in judgment and try to catch up again with R2-D2. Neither prospect held much appeal for him, but there was a third choice. He could sit here, shining in the sunlight until his joints locked, his internals overheated, and the ultraviolet burned out his photoreceptors. He would become another monument to the destructive power of the binary desert, like the colossal organism whose picked corpse he had just encountered. Already, his receptors were beginning to go. He reflected. It seemed he saw something moving in the distance. Heat distortion, probably. No, it was definitely light on metal, and it was moving toward him. His hope soared. Ignoring the warnings from his damaged leg, he rose and began waving frantically. It was, he saw now, definitely a vehicle, though of a type unfamiliar to him, but a vehicle it was, and that implied intelligence and technology. He neglected, in his excitement, to consider the possibility that it might not be of human origin. So I cut off my power, shut down the afterburners, and dropped in low on Deke's tail. Luke finished, waving his arms wildly. He and Biggs were walking in the shade outside the power station. Sounds of metal being worked came from somewhere within where Fixer had finally joined his robot assistant in performing repairs. I was so close to him, Luke continued excitedly. I thought I was going to fry my instrumentation. As it was, I busted up the Skyhopper pretty bad. That recollection inspired a frown. Uncle Owen is pretty upset. He grounded me for the rest of the season. Luke's depression was brief. Memory of his feat overrode its immortality. You should have been there, Biggs. You ought to take it a little easier, his friend cautioned. You may be the hottest bush pilot this side of Mos Eisley, Luke, but those little skyhoppers can be dangerous. They move awfully fast for tropospheric craft. Faster than they need to. Keep playing engine jockey with one, and someday, whammo! He slammed on his fist violently into his open palm. You're going to be nothing more than a dark spot on the damp side of a canyon wall. Look who's talking, Luke retorted. Now that you've been on a few big automatic starships, you're beginning to sound like my uncle. You've gotten soft in the cities. He swung spiritedly at Biggs, who blocked the movement easily, making a half-hearted gesture of counterattack. Biggs' easygoing smugness dissolved into something warmer. I've missed you, kid. Luke looked away, embarrassed. Things haven't exactly been the same since you left either, Biggs. It's been so... Luke hunted for the right word and finally finished helplessly. So quiet. His gaze traveled across the sandy desert streets of Anchorhead. It's always been quiet, really. Biggs grew silent, thinking. He glanced around. They were alone out here. Everyone else was back inside the compartmentative coolness of the power station. As he leaned close, Luke sensed an unaccustomed solemnness in his friend's tone. Luke, I didn't come back just to say goodbye or to crow over everyone because I got through the academy. Again, he seemed to hesitate, unsure of himself. Then he blurted out rapidly, not giving himself a chance to back down. But I want somebody to know I can't tell my parents. Gaping at Biggs, Luke could only gulp. No what? What are you talking about? What can't you tell them? Talking about the talking that's been going on at the academy and other places, Luke. Strong talking. I made some new friends, out-system friends. We agreed about the way certain things are developing, and his voice dropped conspiratorially. When we reach one of the peripheral systems, we're going to jump ship and join the Alliance. Luke stared back at his friend and tried to picture Biggs, fun-loving, happy-go-lucky, live-for-today Biggs, as a patriot, afire with a rebellious fervor. You're going to join the rebellion? He stated. You've got to be kidding me. How? Damp down, will you? The bigger man cautioned, glancing figuratively back toward the power station. You've got a mouth like a crater. I'm sorry, Luke whispered rapidly. I'm quiet. Listen how quiet I am. You can barely hear me at... Biggs cut him off and continued. A friend of mine from the academy has a friend on Bastine who might enable us to make contact with an armed rebel unit. A friend of... You're crazy, Luke announced with conviction, certain his friend had gone mad. You could wander around forever trying to find a real rebel outpost. Most of them are only myths. This twice-removed friend could be an Imperial agent. You'd end up on Kessel, or worse. If rebel outposts were so easy to find, the Empire would have wiped them all out years ago. I know it's a long shot, Biggs admitted reluctantly. If I don't contact them, then... A peculiar light came into Biggs' eyes. A conglomeration of newfound maturity and something else. I'll do what I can on my own. He stared intensely at his friend. Luke, I'm not going to wait for the Empire to conscript me into the service. In spite of what you hear over the official information channels, the rebellion is growing, spreading, and I want to be on the right side, the side I believe in. His voice altered unpleasantly, and Luke wondered what he saw in his mind's eye. You should have heard some of the stories I've heard, Luke. Learned of some of the outrages I've learned about. The Empire may have been great and beautiful once, but the people in charge now? He shook his head sharply. It's rotten, Luke, rotten. And I can't do a damn thing. Luke muttered morosely. I'm stuck here. He kicked futilely at the ever-present Anchorhead. I thought you were to enter the academy soon, Biggs observed. If that's so, then you'll have your chance to get off this sand pile. Luke snorted derisively. Not likely. I had to withdraw my application. He looked away, unable to meet his friend's disbelieving stare. I had to. There's been a lot of unrest among the Sand People since you left, Biggs. They've even raided the outskirts of Anchorhead. Biggs shook his head, disregarding the excuse. Your uncle could hold off a whole colony of raiders with one blaster. From the house, sure, Luke agreed, but Uncle Owen's finally got enough evaporators installed and running to make the farm pay off. But he can't guard all of that land by himself, and he says he needs me for one more season. I can't run out on him now. Biggs sighed sadly. I feel for you, Luke. Someday you're going to have to learn to separate what seems to be important from what really is important. He gestured around them. What good is all your uncle's work if it's taken over by the Empire? I've heard that they're starting to imperialize commerce in all the outlying systems. It won't be long before your uncle and everyone else on Tatooine are just tenants, slaving off the greater glory of the Empire. That couldn't happen here, Luke objected, with a confidence he didn't quite feel. You've said it yourself. The Empire, they won't bother with this rock. Things change, Luke. Only the threat of rebellion keeps many in power from doing certain unimaginable things. If that threat is completely removed, well, there are two things men have never been able to satisfy: their curiosity and their greed. There isn't much the high Imperial bureaucrats are curious about. Both men stood silent. A sand whirl traversed the street in silent majesty, collapsing against a wall to send newborn baby zephyrs in all direction. I wish I was going with you, Luke finally murmured. He glanced up. Will you be around long? No, as a matter of fact, I'm leaving in the morning to rendezvous with the Ecliptic. Then I guess I won't be seeing you again. Maybe someday, Biggs declared. He brightened, grinning that disarming grin. I'll keep a lookout for you, Hotshot. Try not to run into the canyon walls in the meantime. I'll be at the Academy the season after, Luke insisted, more to encourage himself than Biggs. After that, who knows? Who knows where I'll end up? He sounded determined. I won't be drafted into the Starfleet, that's for sure. Take care of yourself. You'll always be my best friend. There was no need for a handshake. These two had long since passed beyond that. So long, said Luke. He turned and re-entered the power station. Luke watched Biggs disappear through the door, his own thoughts as chaotic and frenetic as one of Tatooine's spontaneous dust storms. There were any number of extraordinary features unique to Tatooine's surface. Outstanding among them were the mysterious mists, which rose regularly from the ground at the points where desert sands washed up against unyielding cliffs and mesas. Fog in a steaming desert seemed as out of place as cactus on a glacier, but it existed nonetheless. Meteorologists and geologists argued its origin amongst themselves, muttering hard-to-believe theories about water suspended in sandstone veins beneath the sand and incomprehensible chemical reactions which made water rise when the ground cooled, then fall underground again with the double sunrise. It was all very backward, but very real. Neither the mist nor the alien moans of nocturnal desert dwellers troubled R2-D2. However, as he made his careful way up the rocky arroyo, hunting for the easiest pathway to the mesa top, his squarish, broad footpads made clicking sounds loud in the evening light as sand underfoot gave way gradually to gravel. For a moment he paused. He seemed to detect a noise, like metal on rock ahead of him, instead of rock on rock. The sound wasn't repeated, though, and he quickly resumed his ambling ascent. Up the arroyo, too far up to be seen from below, a pebble trickled loose from the stone wall. The tiny figure, which had accidentally dislodged the pebble, retreated mouse-like into a shadow. Two glowing points of light showed under the underlapping folds of brown cape, in a meter from the narrowing canyon wall. Only the reaction of the unsuspecting robot indicated that the presence of a whining beam as it struck him. For a moment, R2-D2 fluoresced eerily in the dimming light. There was a single short electronic squeak, then the tripod's support unbalanced, and the tiny automaton toppled over onto its back, the lights on its front blinking on and off electrically, and the effects of the paralyzing beam. Three travesties of men scurried out from behind concealing boulders. Their motions were more indicative of rodent than humankind, and they stood little taller than the R2 unit. When they saw that the single burst of ever-vading energy had immobilized the robot, they holstered their peculiar weapons. Nevertheless, they approached the listless machine cautiously, with the trepidation of hereditary cowards. Their cloaks were thickly coated with dust and sand. Unhealthy red-yellow pupils glowed cat-like from the depths of their hoods as they studied their captive. The Jaws conversed in low guttural croaks and scrambled analogues of human speech. If, as anthropologists hypothesized, they had ever been human, they had long since degenerated past anything resembling the human race. Several more Jawas appeared. Together they succeeded in alternately hoisting and dragging the robot back down the arroyo. At the bottom of the canyon, like some monstrous prehistoric beast, was a Sandcrawler, as enormous as its owners and operators were tiny. Several dozen meters high, the vehicle towered above the ground on multiple treads that were taller than a tall man. And its metal epidermis was battered and pitted from withstanding untold sandstorms. On reaching the crawler, the Jawas resumed jabbering amongst themselves. R2-D2 could hear them, but failed to comprehend anything. He need not have been embarrassed at his failings. If they so wished, only Jawas could understand other Jawas, for they employed a randomly variable language and drove linguists mad. One of them removed a small disc from a belt pouch and sealed it to R2's unit flank. A large tube protruded from one side of the gargantuan vehicle. They rolled him over to it and then moved clear. There was a brief moan and the whoosh of a powerful vacuum, and the small robot was sucked into the bowels of the Sandcrawler as neatly as a pea up a straw. This part of the job completed, the Jawas engaged in another bout of jabbering, following which they scurried into the crawler via tubes and ladders, for all the world like a nest of mice returning to their holes. None too gently, the suction tube deposited R2 in a small cubicle. In addition to varied piles of broken instruments and outright scrap, a dozen or so robots of differing shapes and sizes populated the prison. A few were locked in the electronic conversation. Others muttered aimlessly about, but when R2 tumbled into the chamber, one voice burst out in surprise.
R2-D2, it is you! It is you!
Called an excited Threepio from the near darkness. He made his way over to the still immobilized repair unit and embraced it most unmechanically. Spotting the small disc sealed onto R2's side, Threepio turned his gaze thoughtfully down to his own chest, where a similar device had likewise been attached. Massive gears, poorly lubricated, started to move. With a groaning and grinding, the monster Sandcrawler turned and lumbered with relentless patience into the desert night. Thus concludes Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The burnished conference table was as soulless and unyielding as the mood of the 8 Imperial senators and officers ranged around it. Imperial troopers stood guard at the entrance to the chamber, which was sparse and coldly lit from the lights on the table and walls. One of the youngest of the 8 was declaiming. He exhibited the attitude of one who had climbed far and fast by methods best not examined too closely. General Tagg did possess a certain twisted genius, but it was only partly that ability which had lifted him to his present exalted position. Other talents had proven equally effective. Though his uniform was as neatly molded and his body as clean as that of anyone else in the room, none of the remaining 7 cared to touch him. A certain slimness clung cloyingly to him, a sensation inferred rather than tactile. Despite this, many respected him, or feared him. "I tell you, he's gone too far this time," the general was insisting vehemently. "This Sith Lord inflicted on us at the urging of the Emperor will be our undoing. Until the battle station is fully operational, we remain vulnerable. Some of you still don't seem to realize how well equipped and organized the Rebel Alliance is. Their vessels are excellent, their pilots better, and they are propelled by something more powerful than mere engines. This perverse reactional fanaticism of theirs. They're more dangerous than most of you realize. An older officer with facial scars so deeply engraved that even the best cosmetic surgeon could not fully repair them shifted nervously in his chair. Dangerous to your Starfleet, General Tag, but not to this battle station. Wizened eyes hopped from man to man, traveling around the table. I happen to think Lord Vader knows what he's doing. The rebellion will continue only as long as those cowards have a sanctuary, a place where their pilots can relax and their machines can be repaired. Tag objected. I beg to differ with you, Ramodi. I think the construction of this station has more to do with Governor Tarkin's bid for personal power and recognition than with any justifiable military energy or strategy. Within the Senate, the rebels will continue to increase their support as long. The sound of the single doorway sliding aside and the guards snapping to attention cut him off. His head turned, as did everyone else's. Two individuals as different in appearance as they were united in their objectives had entered the chamber. The nearest to Tag was a thin, hatchet-faced man with hair and a form borrowed from an old broom in the expression of a quiescent piranha. The Grand Moff Tarkin, governor of numerous outlying Imperial territories, was dwarfed by the broad, armored bulk of Darth Vader. Tag, unintimidated but subdued, slowly resumed his seat as Tarkin assumed his place at the end of the conference table. Vader stood next to him, a dominating presence behind the governor's chair. For a minute, Tarkin stared directly at Tag, then glanced away as if he had seen nothing. Tag fumed, but remained silent. As Tarkin's gaze moved around the table, a razor-thin smile of satisfaction remained frozen in his features. The Imperial Senate will no longer be of any concern to us, gentlemen. I have just received word that the Emperor has permanently dissolved that misguided body. A ripple of astonishment ran through the assembly. The last remnants, Tarkin continued, of the old Republic have finally been swept away. This is impossible, Tag interjected. How will the Emperor maintain control of the Imperial bureaucracy? Senatorial representation has not been formally abolished, you must understand, Tarkin explained. It has merely been suspended for the, he smiled a bit more, duration of the emergency. Regional governors will now have direct control and a free hand in administering their territories. This means that the Imperial presence can at least be brought to bear properly on the facilitating worlds of the Empire. From now on, fear will keep potentially traitorous local governments in line. Fear of the Imperial fleet and fear of this battle station. And what of the existing rebellion, Tag wanted to know. If the rebels somehow manage to gain access to a complete technical schema of this battle station, it is remotely possible they might be able to locate a weakness susceptible to minor exploitation. Tarkin's smile shifted to a smirk. Of course, we all know how well guarded, how carefully protected such vital data is. It could not possibly fall into rebel hands. The technical data to which you are obliquely referring, rumbled Darth Vader angrily, will soon be back in our hands if... Tarkin shook the Dark Lord off, something no one else saw at the table would have dared to do. It is immaterial. Any attack made against this station by the rebels would be a suicidal gesture. Suicidal and useless, regardless of any information they manage to obtain. After many long years of secretive construction, he declared with evident pleasure, this station has become the decisive force in this part of the universe. Events in this region of the galaxy will no longer be determined by fate, by decree, or by any other agency. They will be decided by this station. A huge metal-clad hand gestured slightly, and one of the filled cups on the table drifted responsively into it. With a slightly admonishing tone, the Dark Lord continued.
Don't become too proud of this technological terror you've spawned, Tarkin. The ability to destroy a city, a world, a whole system is still insignificant when set against the Force.
The Force? Tag sneered. Don't try to frighten us with your sorcerous ways, Lord Vader. Your sad devotion to that ancient mythology has not helped you conjure up those stolen tapes, or gifted you with the clairvoyance sufficient to locate the rebels' hidden fortress. Why, it's enough to make one laugh. Fit to... Tag's eyes abruptly bulged, and his hands went to his throat as he began to turn a disconcerting shade of blue.
I find,
Vader ventured mildly,
this lack of faith disturbing.
Enough of this, Tarkin snapped, distressed. Vader, release him. This bickering amongst ourselves is pointless. Vader shrugged as if it were of no consequence. Tag slumped in his seat, rubbing his throat, his weary gaze never leaving the dark giant. Lord Vader, will you provide us with the location of the rebel fortress by the time this station is certified operational? Tarkin declared. That known, we will proceed to it and destroy it utterly, crushing this pathetic rebellion in one swift stroke.
As the Emperor wills it,
Vader added, not without sarcasm.
So shall it be.
If any of the powerful men seated around the table found this disrespectful tone objectionable, a glance at Tag was sufficient to dissuade them from mentioning it. And here is where I'm going to break. Until tomorrow, my friends. I'll be back here at 5 p.m. Eastern. Thanks for watching.